The wet tropics of far north Queensland extend from Cooktown to Townsville. The combination of World Heritage listed forest and fringing coral reefs is unique. Rainforests have existed in the wet tropics for the past 100 million years. Approximately 1/3 of Australia's mammal species live here, and 13 of these are found nowhere else in the world. This is the story of how communities across the region have worked together to restore and maintain the forests in the hope that their unique natural values are preserved for future generations. For thousands of years, these forests have been the home to Aboriginal people of the region, the traditional owners. When the first allocation of land was opened to the settlers in the late 1800s, they were required to clear and cultivate as a condition of occupancy. While there's widespread recognition of the importance of conservation today, there was a time when there was a real possibility that the forests would be extinguished without anyone really understanding their value. Many people who still live in the area were part of a protest movement to protect what was left of the rainforest. Rosemary Hill was part of that movement.
The wet tropics rainforest, of course, was not always protected. It was subject to some quite substantial logging, and particularly in the 1970s, one of the big issues was the first opening up of Mount Windsor tableland. Now, Mount Windsor tableland is a very special part of the wet tropics. It's been isolated climatically for periods of the past and quite a long way from Cairns, and so the first road was put in there for logging in 1976, and it was a virgin rainforest, so they started pulling out some very big logs, and that was one of the first issues that conservationists got involved in. There was a protest in 1981. People were arrested for picketing the logging trucks, and the Rescue the Rainforest campaign had started in 1981. There'd been the declaration of the Cape Tribulation National Park in 1981 by Joe Peterson, the Daintree Road blockades in 1983 and 1984. The whole thing had built up to a decision by the federal government to intervene and to stop the logging and put the area on the World Heritage List.
When I was here doing my PhD fieldwork, it was right in the heat of all the World Heritage controversy, and there was a pretty active timber industry here. There was a lot of people that adamantly felt that they had inherent right to log forests, and Bjelke Peterson came up here and he had a series of rallies in places like Ravenshoe and Millamilla and Malanda, and he basically incited people to riot. He described it as a war communist plot because there were communist countries that were signatories to the World Heritage Convention, that that there would be a takeover of the land, that people would be thrown off their land. Graham Richardson, who was the environment minister under the Hawke government, came and went to Ravenshoe and was physically attacked.
And there was to be no polite welcome this time.
He was driving into Ravenshoe, and they brought a logging truck out and they blocked the road, and he was forced to get out.
It won't be state forest, it will be World Heritage Park, and we are not interested in World Heritage Park.
The flashpoint came when the minister and his party attempted to leave for another meeting at neighbouring Sally.
I remember going to one of the meetings. I used to go along to the meetings that the loggers held to just try and be there and put an alternative point of view. And they weren't just talking about the logging, they were talking about the tobacco industry, they were talking about losing abattoirs and a lot of the rural decline that Australia was facing and still faces. So that issue got very mixed up with a whole lot of other issues. The important things to understand though about the wet tropics conservation is it was a community effort that got the wet tropics protected, backed up by science, but led by the community. And I think it's really important to understand that.
Scientific research had also been underway. Its developments were soon to help in the global decision to protect the forests. Australian scientists were an important part of that process. A young Peter Stanton, working in the forestry department, was to meet one of those scientists.
A lot of the things that we were logging at the time all had trade names, but nobody could tell me what they were botanically. And I spent a lot of time collecting from trees that had been felled and trying to work out what species they were. And I met Jeff at that time when he was working in central Queensland. Jeff was a technical assistant to ecologist Dr. Len Webb. At the same time, Jeff was working on the classification of Australian rainforests with Len, and they set out plots in samples of rainforest representing different types of rainforest from New Guinea right down to southern New South Wales. I spent days actually helping them work on their plots and learnt an immense amount about the identification of rainforest species and the ecology.
Jeff, instead of trying to categorise forests on the basis of the species that are in them, it was classifying them on the structure. So how tall they were, how many layers were in them, whether there were buttresses underneath them, what the size of the leaves were. And I think that made it much more easy for people to start to work with rainforests because they were able to classify them in a way without having the detailed taxonomic knowledge to know what the species were.
Jeff Tracy and Len Webb had classified the rainforests into 13 major structural types that are still used by scientists today.
In the lead up to the World Heritage inscription, Isla Quito of the Queensland Rainforest Conservation Society was commissioned by the federal government to provide a rationale for World Heritage listing in the wet tropics rainforest. And a large part of the argument hinged on the existence of so-called primitive plants. Right back at the beginning, Australia was part of a larger continent at the time called Gondwana. Those Gondwanic elements survived when Australia drifted apart from the other continents. The work of Len Webb and Jeff Tracy had identified not only where these plants existed, but also hotspots where these plants were in large numbers. And they came up with the idea, which was a little bit revolutionary at the time, that Australia was actually the cradle of the rainforest, and certainly made the arguments for World Heritage inscription much easier.
In 1988, the wet tropics received World Heritage listing. Although now protected, past clearing had left many isolated fragments of forest. Members of the community began to see the importance of restoring the native species to maintain the long-term health of the environment.
Tony came to Atherton to work in the new CSIRO in 1970. It became a crusade of his. His life work was to convince people that they should be planting North Queensland native trees up here. This is where Tony's planted and recreated a Marby rainforest. This area was originally Marby, but it's been cleared on the tablelands because this is where the best land for farming is. There's only less than 4% of Marby forest left in Australia. Tony was the person who called it Marby forest. Marby or Marpee is the Aboriginal word for tree kangaroo, and tree kangaroos live in the Marby forests.
I'm Mrs. Joan Wright. I'm a botanist, and so that's one of the reasons why I enjoy far north Queensland. The plants and the trees are so individual and so interesting. The tableland was pretty well covered with it in the past. The forestry department had a good tree planting record, but it's for timber production, not for restoration of the whole habitat. I can remember the day when we lived near the lake in Yungaburra, near Lake Tinaroo, when Jeff Tracy walked down the road and came to see us. I think he saw the necessity for careful reforestation and said that he had the idea that we must persuade the National Parks Department, not the Forestry Department, to plant native rainforest trees and a variety. There was a head man in the National Parks Department, Peter Stanton, and he was one of the ones who was very influential in helping us to get started.
And it had long been my ambition to set up a nursery where we could grow our own trees with local species and plant them on parks. And I talked to Jeff, who had this vision of the same sort of thing happening right across the landscape, and said, well, why don't we see if I can get the department to build a nursery at the Lake Eacham base, where we were already raising a few plants, and see if we can work out some sort of potential partnership with private individuals. And out of all that, the melting pot of ideas and actions came Treat.
And it was quite an occasion. And because they were connected with the National Parks Department, we've always maintained that very important organic relationship with that department.
Treat meets every Friday morning, and we have a whole lot of people come and they talk to each other and learn from each other, and they do nursery work, and we all think it's lovely. We love coming out here.
Treats has grown to a membership of 460 plus families, which gives us around about 900 individuals. The social thing is getting together over a cup of tea, and the QPWS boys always give us information as to what's been going on during the week as far as fruit gathering is concerned, because we do prepare the fruit here into seed.
Having someone to chat with when you live on your own, that's a nice place to come.
Just knowing that I'm making a viable contribution, you know, it's something concrete. It's a high point of my week, actually, yeah.
I enjoy doing something essential for the country.
We support each other, Treat and Parks. Yeah, we couldn't do some of the things to the extent we do without their help.
That Park Service private cooperation has left its mark across the landscape of the tablelands.
In 1989, other nurseries were formed, this time closely aligned with the local councils.
Jeff Tracy initiated starting a program called the Wet Tropics Tree Planting Scheme. And the aim of that scheme was to actually retrain timber workers that had been put out of work and put them into sort of a revegetation industry. So he was very interested in the livelihood of these people, and it wasn't just putting them out of work and that was it. He believed that there could be other work available for these, and I think he also had a great vision of, by trying to get these tree planting schemes directly attached to the local government themselves, that in the long term it would have an impact on the council, and then they would start to incorporate a lot of those environmental issues and natural resource management issues into local government. But also he had a bigger vision too about trying to utilise degraded areas particularly across the tablelands, where the soils weren't quite so good for agriculture and there was very, very steep slopes. He saw that there was ample opportunity there to actually plant local rainforest trees and develop another industry there.
With a highly fragmented landscape like you tend to have in the wet tropics and here on the Atherton tablelands, you've ended up with lots of isolates of fragmented habitat. The wet tropics is a type of landscape that is going to be disturbed regularly by cyclones and various climatic impacts. When we've got very narrow linkages and small fragments or even isolated trees, That's what is really vulnerable to these cyclonic impacts. Over time, without management and without being close to larger bodies of habitat or without being connected, those fragments will degrade through weed invasion, through disturbance, and slowly populations of the species within them will begin to die out. So the idea is to connect up these high value systems and that they're linking back into the larger bodies.
We're at the iconic Donaghy's Corridor. You can see it down here in front of us. It stretches for 500 metres from Wooroonuran National Park, which is the largest national park in North Queensland, across to Lake Barron National Park. Now, Lake Barron National Park is like a little isolated island of rainforest in a sea of grass. So we're trying to join the corridor to stop the isolation of species. It was actually giving connectivity for these isolated animals that were in Lake Barron to get into Wooroonuran and get some fresh blood in, basically getting genetic diversity, and that's what it was all about. It's about 100 metres wide, a few hundred feet wide. Started in 1995. Some money came in from the Wet Tropics Management Authority. So each year about 3,000 to 4,000 trees were planted. In '96 we butted up to Lake Barron, and then 97 and 98 we basically closed the centre off. We've basically walked away from this project in terms of maintenance. We have a canopy, there's no issues with light getting in. It's essentially a rainforest now that looks after itself. But this corridor here with Treat as a partner, we were leading tropical restoration in the world at the time. The corridor itself has been recognised globally. It was basically a Southern Atherton Tablelands bid that went in from Treat. It was nominated to this Global Restoration Network, and Treat were awarded in the top 20 globally, so it's a very significant project. I'm hoping also that we're able to share our knowledge globally so we can actually, look after the lungs of the earth, basically.
Studies have shown that even small fragments can provide stepping stones across the landscape for species that may be dispersing.
Well, this place proved to be a refuge when a cassowary turned up in our garden Boxing Day 2006. It was searching for territory, and a lot of the tableland had been smashed after Cyclone Larry, and it wandered down the Barron River and arrived at our place. A neighbour rang to say, "Did you know there's a cassowary in your garden?" My husband was very sick at the time, but he forgot to be sick. He was so excited to find that the plot he had planted up had lured a cassowary to his garden, which shows how important even a garden, a replanted pocket in a garden, can be helping a wild animal to survive.
If you've got any interest in natural history, the Atherton Tablelands is a fantastic place. We've got huge diversity, incredible numbers of amphibians and possums and birds. It's just fantastic. I'm learning new stuff every day. Some of the areas around here have been rehabilitated. For example, Peterson Creek in Yungaburra.
Yungaburra is just a nice little village. Has a great village atmosphere, and we've been doing quite a bit of work in the last 10-15 years in Yungaburra. Peterson Creek in the past was a main focal point for the town. We realised that in the 20s and 30s they would congregate on Frawley's Pool, which is still a magnificent little pool of water. Treat commenced planting beside Peterson Creek at the source, which is behind Lake Eacham. We could see that the treat were going to take many years to get down to Yungaburra. So we thought the thing we could be doing was setting up our own project.
Peterson Creek is, well, it's my back boundary at the property, and when I retired, David Leach came and said we should be doing something about the creek, and So we formed a little group, and that was in 1998, and we've been working at it ever since, revegetating. And our project started with the Eastern Tinaroo Catchment Land Care Group, which was partly set up by School for Field Studies. And in those days, when we had the project on, the whole school would turn up, sometimes 32 students and 3 or 4 faculty, and they'd just get in and work a couple of hours and then disappear as quick as they turned up, but the job was done.
Peterson Creek in Yungaburra, absolutely wonderful. There are tree kangaroos starting to use that. People go there frequently to see platypus.
So people are coming back, tourists looking for somewhere to walk, to exercise, but equally as much the locals are using it as a walking track. And each year we try to extend it by another perhaps half a kilometre.
I can take my customers there.
Joey.
They have a wonderful experience and they're very impressed with you. A community like Yungaburra where people will band together to create such a wonderful resource for everybody.
I think the community are very proud of it. And it certainly features in all the tourist brochures, both as a nice vegetated walk and as a place where you can see unusual animals.
Trying to repair the damage was done by our so-called pioneers, planting trees. And I'm the oldest, 91.
As well as their hard efforts on the ground, members of the Yungaburra Land Care Group have donated their own funds to improving the area. In 2008, Lloyd funded a suspension bridge across Peterson Creek for the benefit of the whole community.
You know, many young people today, they live in such a technology-driven world, and their lives consist of Facebook and computers and mobile phones. There's a US author who coined a term called nature deficit disorder, and that increasingly our communities and our societies are really being removed from the splendor of a world that very few of us are fortunate to work and live in. For them to have an experience like this with land care down at Lower Peterson Creek, learning about environmental education, really opens up a whole new world for them. The Wet Tropics Management Authority, each year they give the Young Cassowary Awards, and I've watched how that has grown from 10 to 15 entries to last year over 100 entries, which really shows that, you know, youth are increasingly becoming engaged and recognizing that this is a valuable thing for their futures and their interest. The School for Field Studies has been in the Wet Tropics now for close to 30 years, and we bring American university students over here to really study a very, very spectacular place on Earth, the World Heritage Rainforest, which sits right at the link to the Great Barrier Reef. And we educate students in university core programming around restoration ecology initiatives.
This is one of the areas that has the highest biodiversity in Australia of plants and animals. So, and the restoration projects are vital for us to maintain that biodiversity. Well, I think one of the most important things nowadays is to educate young people and show them to have a first-hand experience with the wildlife of the region. And empower them with passion for the environment as well. I think that's vital.
Local Indigenous youth are encouraged to become involved in the maintenance and rehabilitation of the landscape.
Through the Green Army program, state government initiative, we're able to engage Indigenous youth, and out of that program, which is a 6-month program, we can identify participants, could be half a dozen, could be 1 or 2, to give them jobs. We're doing all sorts of works from forestry to regeneration to weed surveys to mapping, all sorts of things. So we're actually giving basically a job and hopefully a career path forever.
That hole there, no more from there. We're planting some trees, or this is a marby species of trees that we're planting here for today. The owner, from what I gathered, he wants to plant this little gap for the tree kangaroos, yeah, for the muppies. I'm the field crew leader. I manage the boys to basically do the job what we're doing today, digging holes, marking out holes for the trees, yeah.
The Barron River system is one of the most heavily impacted river systems in the wet tropics. Its degradation is largely due to past clearing of native vegetation. In 2005, the Green Corridor project began, an initiative of the Barron Catchment Care Community Group.
The conception of it was to replant the riparian section of the whole of the Barron River from Mount Hypipamee all the way down to the mouth at Machin's Beach. 165 kilometres from source to sea. One of the main reasons that we're restoring the riparian zone along the river is to improve the water quality, which eventually ends up out of the reef.
Treat's interaction with the Green Corridor is producing of the trees and putting them in the ground. Last year we had one planting every fortnight from November through to April. Following the planting is always a barbecue where we can always get together. The person in charge of the planting in that particular time then gives us a rundown of the history of maybe the corridor that has been planned and also the landowner's history of how it was cleared.
This will make them feel good in the tummy, all nice and warm. They've been warmed in the brain because of all the good works they've done this morning, and now they can have a nice warm tummy full of hot tea and sausages and lentil burgers for some.
Increasingly, landholders have joined the restoration effort, recognising the benefits for their own farms and the importance of their role as land managers. Many have become passionate advocates of land care.
A lot of people know about these trees that have been planted here, and they know us Bonadillos as the people with the trees along the river. So it's doing really, really well. They're growing fantastic.
This particular planting in the highlands of the Atherton Tablelands, it's going to act as an important wildlife corridor to link up other nature refuges. It's in my heart, even though we're farmers, for every creek and every river to be re-vegged for water quality, for our reef, for biodiversity. It's good for your cattle, it's good for everything, it's good for everybody.
They're planting about 10,000 trees, which is amazing, and you have a look at the whole area and then what we can possibly do in the future too. One, for us, it means that we're not losing our farm down the river.
We had, with Treat, we had 2 volunteer tree planting days, and each day we put in 2,000 or 2,500, and the first day we got about 70 volunteers, and they'd finished by about 9:30 in the morning. So it's nice to know that we're not out there alone doing this. They're right next door, sort of continuing the work, so it all connects up, and I think we're all pretty happy with one another at this stage. Look at these trees here. 10 months old. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if these tree kangaroos and cassowaries are still here for our next generation?
The fears that we had about the future of rainforest in '87 were related to the potential destruction of rainforest by mechanical means, humans directly. They've now been superseded by fears that are greater than that, which are related to climate change.
Because it isn't only being interested in the trees, it's all the questions of what is happening to the atmosphere.
The wet tropics are probably more vulnerable than
most other systems around the world, because of the evolutionary history of the region, we've got a lot of species that are only found in like the top half of the mountains, and with temperature increasing it's pushing them up the mountain, and they've got nowhere to go. They're sort of stuck on the tops of these mountains. I never actually set out to look at climate change at all. I was a rainforest biologist and going along quite happy until we did some analyses back in about 2003 which suggested that maybe half of the species that I was working on would go extinct this century, and that kind of shocked the pants off me. And we're talking about the loss of the very species that this was made a World Heritage Area to protect. I mean, it was all of these unique endemic species that are found nowhere else in the world. That's the reason we made it a World Heritage Area, and they're the things that we're standing to lose under climate change.
Due to the efforts of many individuals, some of the damage to the forest has been repaired. Many of the early pioneers of wet tropics rainforest protection are no longer with us. Their legacy lives on. As in the past, the future of these rare and magnificent forests will require the ongoing efforts of a new generation.